Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Central Lancashire Strategic Planning Joint Advisory Committee meeting. Can I have your nominations for chair, please?
Councillor Evans. I'll second that.
Don't want it. Right. Thank you. Thanks for your nominations. Thank you for attending this meeting. We have some members present in the Civic Centre and there's some joining via Teams. Members of the public are welcome to watch the open session on YouTube as well. Please be aware, however, that only members physically present will be entitled to vote. I'll begin with some housekeeping. Please can you ensure that mobile phones are either switched off or turned on silent. If you're dialing into the meeting from home, please ensure that you cannot be overheard and that all devices, including smart speakers, are turned off to maintain confidentiality. We're not anticipating a fire alarm in the building tonight, but if the alarm does go off, you should leave via the fire exit in the wheel room, which is next door, and then congregate on the car park outside. For members present in the Civic Centre, please use the microphones in front of you when you wish to speak. That way people who aren't in the Civic Centre can hear you as well as us. You turn them on by pressing the red speak button, which is the bottom right hand one. It says here the guillotine will come down at 8:30 this evening if the meeting is still ongoing, as we have a by-election count in this room later on this evening, so we need to be aware by then anyway. Apologies for absence. I've got one, Councillor Caleb Tomlinson. Is there anybody out there, anybody else with any apologies? No, right. Item number 4, minutes of the meeting, Tuesday the 22nd of June 2021. Everybody seen the minutes?
Happy to move that, Chair.
Thank you. Seconded? I'll second them. Right, anybody any comments, questions? No? Right. I don't think we're going to get to half-8 at this rate. Number 5, declarations of interest. Anybody, any declarations of interest they want to declare? No. Right, in that case, takes us on to item number 6. Density study findings. Can I ask Mark Vaughan from IVE Planning to present this item, please?
You can. Good evening all. Just bear with me a second while I share the presentation with you. So, good evening. I'm Mark Vaughan. I'm a Chartered Surveyor and Director of Hive London Planning. And I'm here to present the findings of our recent report into housing densities across central Lancashire. So, first of all, what was the purpose of this report? Well, it was to support the Central Lancashire local plan through undertaking a factual, evidence-based approach to housing densities from built sites in the recent past within the Central Lancashire geography. This is to inform the likely capacities achievable from sites to be allocated under the emerging Central Lancashire local plan. It aims to provide a robust and defensible approach to future capacities based on actual evidence from this area from sites built out in recent years. So, the approach we took. Well, first of all, we sought to define zones. You'll appreciate there's a vast difference between what gets built out in Preston city centre compared to the region's more rural settlements. These zones were agreed with officers from the 3 authorities and wherever possible aligned with the existing planning policy designations. As you can see on screen, these zones were rural settlements, suburban, inner urban and town centre, Preston city centre and other rural. And as you can see from the image there, we've mapped all of the 3 local authorities and put all areas into these zones you can see on screen. So how did we actually go about calculating density? Different people will talk about density in different ways. House builders often like to define density by only that land which can be built on and the essential roads. This helps them quote higher figures and analyse the efficiency of their site. Given the expansive area of sites and the number of sites we were looking at, we decided to use gross land area as the approach. This takes the number of consented units on a particular site and divides by the area within the red line boundary of the planning application. Throughout this instruction, you'll see that we've sought to keep a factual rather than subjective approach to things. This approach avoids crude assumptions about likely net to gross ratios of a site and instead is based on the facts available. So, getting into the findings. As you can see, there's a general trend on a sub-regional basis for developments to get denser as they get closer to the town and city centres. This shouldn't come as any great surprise. We'll drill into the detail in this in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. So, further findings. There are some typologies of sites where the market is very consistent on a sub-regional basis and others where the market is much more localised, and I've provided 2 examples here on screen. Firstly, the suburban sites are very similar no matter which local authority boundary they fall within. As you may have guessed, these are the markets dominated by the volume house builders. However, when we look at the inner urban and town centre sites, there's much more variation between the 3 local authorities. This suggests the markets in these areas are much more localised. Preston City Centre showed a huge step change in densities. We felt regard needed to be had in terms of the range of densities available within Preston City Centre. Although the average density was 477 dwellings per hectare, the actual range of the sites we found was between 176 dwellings per hectare and 978. The rural sites were as expected and they were generally lowest density, but what was surprising was the range of providers. As you can see there, the densities range from between 12 and 39 dwellings per hectare. Unlike the suburban areas, which as said before are generally dominated by the volume house builders, these areas contain development by housing associations, smaller niche or executive style developers, and some volume house builders as well. So, moving on to the summary table. And I appreciate this may be a little bit small for some of you. There's quite a bit of data on this particular slide, so I'll try and talk through the key elements of it. Rural settlements. These averaged at 27 dwellings per hectare across central Lancashire, albeit they were notably lower in the South Ribble area at 21. As you can see there, both Chorley and Preston City Council, the average density was 29 dwellings per hectare. Moving on to the suburban sites, as mentioned before, there's very little to distinguish sites within either Chorley, South Ribble or Preston. Very little difference at all, and they came in at an average again of 27 dwellings per hectare. Moving towards the inner urban and town centre, these are generally higher densities, but much more localised markets, as mentioned before. The inner urban areas of Preston attract a much more urban style, higher density development than either of the other 2 locations. And rural sites, as touched on before, as you would expect, generally lower densities, and we've found those to be 21 per hectare. And as you can see there, just jumping back one, Preston City Centre, vast difference between the densities in Preston City Centre and the other areas we looked at. We found the average to be 477 dwellings per hectare, but as stated earlier, within that there's a huge range of densities on the sites provided. So there's a brief overview of the work we've undertaken and the findings. Happy to take any questions.
Right, thanks, Mark, for your report. Anybody, any questions or comments? Alistair?
Just a quick question. Obviously, we've previously had targets around the 30 to 35 range in lots of areas. I know it's not consistent across all areas and it's changed over time. That's obviously shaped where we are now, which is perhaps why those suburban areas where most of our sites have gone are probably around that kind of number. How much is that distorted or compared to other areas elsewhere, and are we consistent with other similar sort of places across the country? Is there a vast variance between different parts of the country or even different parts of Lancashire?
Okay, thanks for that question, Alistair. Mark?
I think generally what we've seen here is that particularly the suburban areas, those areas dominated by the volume house builders, I think what we'll find is that actually certainly across most parts of Lancashire and most similar market areas, you will find that it's a very similar style. The products, yes, there is variance between the products. You will find a difference between a persimmon house and a red row house, for example. But actually, when you do what we've done, which is take an averaged approach, I think you'll find across Lancashire it's a very similar figure. The other point I'd make in regard to densities is I find it's a little bit like build cost. You can talk to 5 different build costs and they have a very different interpretation of how a standard house build cost is made up. It's the same with densities, really. House builders will talk about densities as a net density, because for us that involved a sort of subjective view around what a net to gross ratio is. We've done it on a gross basis. So I think if you were to take these figures and go to that next level of really scrutinise site by site, I think on a net area you would find those figures quite a bit higher.
Okay, thanks for that. Anybody else, any questions or comments? Yeah.
I realise I'm not on your committee, but are we going to get copies of this? Are they going to be circulated so we can have a proper look at it in our own time, as it were, rather than looking at the very small amount of detail on there?
Yeah, we can arrange that for you. The reason you've not had copies up to now is that it hasn't been agreed with the officers yet. So, yeah, we will circulate them.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thanks. On the figures for Preston City Centre, how do those figures compare with other cities or large towns? I just wonder if there's a dynamic in terms of development in larger towns and cities, which leads to a much higher density than you would find in smaller towns and cities.
We haven't. It wasn't part of the instruction to do a comparison across areas, but I can give you a personal view. I mean, I think we all know that Preston City Centre, the city living market there has taken off in recent years. And what you've seen is the likes of the Heaton Group at Bishopgate, where they've taken former office building, and that's now a high quality, high density development that I think Preston City Centre didn't have going back 5 years ago. And I think, hopefully we will continue to see the development of city living in Preston. But I think what we've seen, if you go back, who knows, 15, 20 years even, you look at the big cities like Liverpool and Manchester, where city living really took off quite a period of time ago. And I think what we're seeing now is it is coming to smaller cities and it's coming to smaller towns in the area. And I think personally that's a good thing. I think it depends what you compare it to. I suspect if you plotted it on a graph, you would see generally a more highly populated city would have much denser development. I mean, again, you take Manchester City Centre and you've only got to look around there to see the density of development going on. Whereas, of course, just within this study area, there isn't anything quite like Preston City Centre in Chorley or in South Ribble in terms of the development that's going on. So it is, I think Preston City Centre is quite unique in a sub-regional basis, and I suspect it's probably on a par, possibly punching above its weight in terms of the density of development and the city living when you compare it with similar sized towns and cities.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Anybody else? No, in that case, the report is only for noting. Thanks, Mark, for taking time out to present to us tonight.
You're welcome.
You're welcome to stay if you want.
I think I'll leave you to it at that point, but thank you for the offer.
Well, thanks. Good night.
Good night.
So are we happy to note the report? Yep.
Chair, presuming this is going to come back for discussion at subsequent meetings once we've had a chance to digest the information as has been raised.
Yeah, will come back to the January meeting, hopefully. I think we should have a draft report by then, and the PowerPoint from today will be shared with the minutes.
Yep, thank you for that. Right, item number 7, Central Lancashire Local Plan update. Carolyn?
Thank you, Chair. So my normal update. I have attended recent local plan working groups for 2 of the authorities. Apologies for those who've heard quite a lot of this already, but there is some new bits in there today. So the first bit to update you on is the local development scheme. You'll all be aware that the plan has been delayed. This has been due to a number of reasons, such as resourcing for the team, ability of home teams to provide support due to the number of appeals that we're waiting on, and also the need to ensure we had sufficient evidence base in place. Some studies which are on this note as well to update you on, and also awaiting the results from the work that has been undertaken for the GLP. So we are for updating the local development scheme itself in the new year. So I hope to bring that to you early in the new year, and looking for consultation as early as we can get in 2022, but that will be dependent on resources coming into the team. On the back of some of the work we're trying to do to speed up the plan, we've had some sessions with the Planning Advisory Service, PAS, and they've just issued a note which I've circulated to officers this week, and they've identified a number of areas that we can focus on to make sure we meet the requirements of MPPF, and some areas that we need to look at for the local plan. They've also looked at ways we can look at speeding up processes, but one of the first pieces of work they asked us to look at was the Sheila, which is our Strategic Housing Employment Land Availability Assessment. So they identified a need to have that independently reviewed, and we appointed land use consultants to do that work. And that's a further item on the agenda today, so I won't go into too much detail on that one at this moment. We are progressing work on the preferred options, and we have a number of pieces of work being undertaken at the moment. One of the key pieces is a study being done by land use consultants. And we've also been doing a review of our policies to understand what existing policies can be updated in line with MPPF to reduce the amount of work that we need to do through the local plan itself. On the strategic flood risk assessment, we are progressing with the level 2 work, but that is dependent on the speed we get the sites ready. So the level 2 work will look specifically at sites that have been identified as having a flood risk, and they will undertake that assessment for us. I know about the climate change work, and we are still waiting for, again, the results from the county to understand what additional work we need to do, but I understand that should be with us early in the new year. We've also been keeping up to date with changes around biodiversity net gain and the Environment Bill, but I'll not steal Zoe's thunder on that one. On local plan viability, we have appointed consultants Aspinall Verdi. So they've now been put on board, and they will be looking at full plan viability as well as an update to the community infrastructure levy. And we have raised the point with them on the SIL, where guidance may change by government, that they will be able to adapt to that as necessary. Also note that land use consultants have started work on part of the integrated assessment, specifically the screening stage of the habitats regulation assessment. So that stage should be ready to go out from December for consultation with the stats. On the employment land review, I think I said in here we were expecting the report back from BE Group. We've just had the draft report. It's very long. It's come in this week. And the key aim of that review was to understand what the implications were of COVID and how that might have affected the type and demand for employment space across central Lancashire. And then just a final note really on duty to cooperate, so that we're continuing to engage and you know, we'll continue to do that going forward, Chair. I'm happy to take any specific questions.
Right, thank you, Carolyn, for your comprehensive report. Anybody, any questions or comments?
Thank you, Chair. On 22-23, we're talking about Greenbelt. What we're saying, I think what we're saying is we're looking at the boundaries of the Greenbelt. Is the officers are we going to be looking at putting some Greenbelt into the new plans?
So on that, central, I didn't go into huge detail because I was hoping that you may have read the report. I've been trying to be quick on what I'm saying. So there were 5 key aims of that piece of work that land use consultants are doing. So one aspect is a strategic Greenbelt review. One aspect is reviewing a number of open policy designations, including major open space. They're also looking at our areas of separation policy and the need for safeguarded land going forward. And they are independently looking at that without the prejudicing themselves by looking at any sites. So this is purely to understand how our Greenbelt is functioning against the 5 tests and MPPF. And they will then assess if it is correct and functioning as it should be in our areas which might not be. It's also looking at whether our boundaries are correct, and also our settlement boundaries, a review of those. So there's lots of things that they're doing. If we are then in the point of needing to look at land within the Greenbelt, this independent assessment will give us understanding of those areas that are performing strongly in those tests against those that aren't. It will also enable us to look at, if we need to look at Greenbelt release, it needs to be sustainable locations. It shouldn't just be any sites that developers wish to take forward. It needs to be those sites that are sustainable and deliverable if we get down to that point of deciding that that is the route we need to go down. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
David?
If I could just follow up from that one, I mean, I think there's going to be an important issue in terms of where we are doing a lot of residential development, of ensuring that there are green spaces. In northwest Preston, we've got the linear park, but I can think in Preston of the dangers in certain areas of green areas being totally lost and just be total urban sprawl, and that's not what we should be doing if we're planning. So I think that's important. The thing I wanted to pick up was the climate change thing. Certainly the feedback I'm getting from members in Preston is climate change needs to be an important part of the local plan, and I think in terms of engaging the public, I think that's going to be a key issue. And if I can just throw something that isn't on here in, just for a thought, again, it's something that's been raised with me by several people in the last few weeks, is around places of worship. And the issues in terms of whether we need a planning policy or something. I mean, to give you an example, I mean, I live on Garstang Road, north-south in Middle Preston. On my side of the road to the west, virtually every place of worship is a Christian place of worship. I can think of 1 or 2 that aren't. Everything on the other side, all the other religions apart from Christian religion, I've got mosques and temples and all the rest of it there. And clearly, as the population moves and changes, I just wonder, that's some of the feedback I'm getting back, is whether planning policy will allow a mature consideration of these issues as the city matures. And it's I just think it's something that's coming through from quite a number of different sources that we will probably having discussions on. Is that appropriate to be put into the local plan in some way?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I've had a conversation with a member at Chorley, brought it to my attention as well about the need for a community facility for celebration for particular religious, people who might need an alcohol-free venue, for instance. It was, in this case it was, and how can we as a planning authority help them do that? And I guess it's understanding that need on that side of things. So we do engage with those religious communities, and I think perhaps that's an example of an area that we do need to look more at. And as Zoe just pointed out as well, it's not just that, it's cemeteries and provision for burial. So some communities may well be happy for cremation, but certain religions aren't. So it's making sure that we've got the provision for that, and the local plan does need to look at that, where the council is looking to provide those facilities. On the green space, it's a debate that we've had, that we see Greenbelt as sacrosanct, and I'm not saying it isn't. I'm not saying it's the area that we should be developing in, but for me, those urban green spaces are, if not just as important, more important. They are the lungs in those locations. And for those people who are in those city centres that can't get access to the surrounding countryside, they provide a vital source of open space and fresh air. So they are areas that we do need to look at and protect. And the policies on green infrastructure in the local plan will need to be very clear on that. Definitely an issue that we need to address, and it's something that local plan is looking at. But I think the really good points on the religious side. I think that there's perhaps better engagement we can do on those.
Right, anybody else? Michael?
Thanks, Chairman, and thank you for the update on the report. Can I just ask, with regard to the ongoing delays in developing the local plan, what risk does that put Central Lancashire at? In terms of housing developments coming forward, is my first question. And the second one is a comment, if I may, Chairman. It follows on from the discussion about the green belt. And yes, green spaces are of vital importance to residents in more built up areas, but nevertheless, the green belt boundaries, in my view, should be sacrosanct, especially when we've got sizable plans, sites included in current local plans which have not been developed, and they should be developed first before we even consider rolling back the green belt to build housing developments. Thank you, Chairman.
So on the local plan, yes, there is a risk of developments coming forward, but there's no more risk than what we're currently facing. I think I note in there that we are currently, I think the three councils, I'm not currently, I'm not sat in front of the inspector, but I know that colleagues around the table have been recently, and that can't continue, and that is impacting on their ability to help support the local plan as well. So that it is imperative that we get a local plan in place as quickly as we can, and to get that 5-year housing supply in place as quickly as we can. We are working on housing evidence as well to support the position of numbers and distribution, and that's a piece of work that is about to be commissioned this week. We've gone through the tender process there, and that will give us that evidence base and understanding on housing need and what we feel is a correct approach for Central Lancashire as well, which will help take things forward.
Thanks, Carolyn. Phil?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We've obviously had this discussion at our local plan working group, so we're sort of quite familiar with the discussions on Greenbelt, and we are quite firm in what we were looking at, and it is protecting our Greenbelt at sort of all costs, really. So that was that one, and that's sort of minuted and noted. And just going back to a comment you made, and I think it's a comment you made about Greenbelt performing strongly. What does that mean?
So there are 5. Yeah, it does that. There are 5. There are 5 tests, and I can't reel them all off because I want to get them in order. But I can send it out to you. I had it ready for the local plan working groups actually, but I haven't got it ready for today. But there are 5 tests that that it has to perform against, and it's kind of graded as how well you perform against that. So strong and to weak, effectively. So if it's performing strongly against each of those 5 tests, it's considered to form, the Greenbelt function in that area is deemed to need to be protected. If it's weak against those, it's identifying that the role that the Greenbelt was established for in that location isn't perhaps as reasoned as we are. Thanks, Zoe. So there's 5 purposes: to check unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas, to prevent neighbouring towns merging into one another, to assist in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns, and to assist in urban regeneration by encouraging the recycling of derelict and urban land. So they're the 5 purposes, and effectively we've got consultants looking at that to test how well it's performing on all 5 of those functions, and it will look at that. So it's a test that we would come against if developers were wanting to release that land. So we are getting it done ourselves independently. So if we do get developers trying to get sites in that we've rejected, we have our own independent evidence that justifies our position. It also helps, I guess, if we are defending applications in the meantime when that comes forward. But that's the purpose of the approach. It's not saying it's weak if it forms, it's just saying it against those tests, it doesn't perform as well.
Can I just ask, just going on from that, who designed those tests and who says those tests are the accurate way of
Whitehall
strengths?
Okay, thanks. Alistair?
Thank you, Chair. Just on the back of what Councillor Green raised, I think one of the risks that we face is I think Paz have raised it, paragraph 10 and then paragraph 20 about the LCC highways work, which is behind where it should be. And I think we've raised this previously. And I will, for one, will certainly be lobbying LCC, and I hope County Councillor Green will as well, to get that work done, which I understand other areas have had done. It would be useful if we got ours prioritised, because there's a risk that it's behind now, and that's a big body of work we need to do that. And that puts all of these, or a lot of these things being behind schedule, put all of our sites at risk, because as the plan runs out, as we're seeing in Chorley, we need to get this plan in place, and therefore we need those reports to be able to rely on. And the risk is if county don't do it, an external consultant would struggle to understand the complexities of central Lancashire to the level that County Council do.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? In that case, thank you for your report and answering all the questions, Carolyn. The item is for noting. Are we noting it? Yep, okay. Thank you. Item 8, local nature recovery strategy and biodiversity net gain. Chloe?
Thank you, Chair.
Easy for you to say.
I'll try and be brief. It is quite techy. I've tried to make it kind of more accessible. But yeah, this report provides members with an overview of the emerging local nature recovery strategy, or LNRS, and something called biodiversity net gain, which are being introduced as part of the Environment Act and a part of the government's drive around climate change and nature recovery. So the local nature recovery strategies will be a system of spatial strategies for nature covering all of England, and each one will have a map with the most valuable existing habitat. I'll move back a little bit. We'll map specific proposals for creating and improving habitat for nature and wider environmental goals, so within the areas that they cover, and then also agree priorities for nature recovery. These are really going to be important both for planning policy but also DM as well going forward, and as part of each council's commitment to investing in nature and also linked to climate change, which we've touched on already. So they are part of the government's overall ambition to improve nature, and they are linked to those state of nature reports and the IPCC reports, etc., that all tell us that a number of species are suffering primarily because of human behaviour. So DEFRA have been doing some consultations on this proposal and what it's going to look like, because it is going to be a huge change for development going forward, and they are going to be mandatory. So it's going to be written down in statute that there's going to have to be a 10% uplift in biodiversity going forward. So because of that, there's been a long lead into the development of the guidance and what will come out in terms of regulations, etc. DEFRA have led on 5 local nature recovery strategy pilots, and information about that is available on the website. So there's 5 areas selected. I think I do list them in the report somewhere. I can't find it now, but I think Cornwall, Greater Manchester, and 3 other areas were the pilots, and they've kind of led in terms of shaping what these strategies are going to look like and what's going to be in them, but also how they will be delivered in terms of the collaboration and also the format of them, and how prescriptive national regulations will be in setting out what they have to have in them, how they have to be consulted, and who signs them off ultimately, and whether that is Whitehall or whether that's at the individual council or local area or partnership that sets them up. So the pilots had 3 main objectives, and this was to test the process for preparing a local nature recovery strategy based on requirements set out in the draft bill. Create a prototype strategy as well, so that we all know what they're going to look like. And then also to determine how they're going to link in with existing spatial planning tools, such as national park management plans, local plans, and so forth. So these pilots have produced prototypes of these strategies, and the key point is that they have 2 things in them: a statement of biodiversity priorities for the area, so for Lancashire, and whilst DEFRA haven't confirmed the spatial geography of these strategies, it's quite accepted that for upper tiers it will be a county-led strategy, but obviously with all the districts feeding in. So for that area, we would have a statement of our biodiversity priorities and then a habitat map. And that habitat map will show where we want to make our investments going forward. So there's a 6-step process, which I won't go through in terms of how they did this piece of work. And the final reports are available online. Some of them are in further progression than others. So for some, they do have a draft LNRS. Some of them just have all kind of some of the ingredients of it, but it is worth looking at some of their websites. So in terms of the identification of responsible authorities, like I said, that's not been announced yet, but it's highly likely that the county will be leading. There is already a Lancashire nature partnership been established, so the county council are already starting to get on with this work, to prepare for the work that we need to do collectively to produce this strategy. The Environment Bill, which is being close now to being enacted, will establish the requirement to produce an LNRS, which will be a statutory requirement. It's envisaged that they all need to provide them by next year, 2022, and then the mandatory requirement for developers to deliver BNG on site will come the year after. So yeah, so in terms of spring 2023, there'll be a national digital register of Bionet Gain Diversity Sites. Is a bit of a mouthful, BNG. So that is where the sites where we'll want to spend the credits that are generated by a development. How are we going to do that? There's going to be something called the biodiversity metric tool, a bit of software really, a bit of kit, that whoever in a local authority will crunch the numbers in terms of when an application comes in and the applicant is saying, this is my proposal, and I think it's going to generate X amount of uplift in biodiversity, so an additional value in woodland or in species, whatever they may be, amphibians, birds, whatever they might be. That information will be fed into a software tool, and we'll be able to verify that as to whether that uplift is correct or not. And so it's quite an important piece of kit, and there is some training, I think it's mentioned later in the report, training coming up for planning. And whilst it's not defined where this responsibility is going to sit, and I think for members, I think in my recommendations, I encourage you to start thinking about how it's going to work in local authorities. There is a view, PAS's view certainly, is that it should sit within planning policy and DM functions. There may be a view actually that you're better using an external consultant because it is quite a specialist area of work. But as I say there in paragraph 24, the idea will be that for every planning application that comes in after 2023, the applicant will have to demonstrate that they are delivering 10% uplift in biodiversity. And that can either be on-site or off-site. And if it's off-site, so if they've not been able to achieve that uplift on-site, that's where your nature strategy comes in, because that's where you'll identify those areas where you essentially want to spend that credit. So that developer, in the same way as affordable housing, open space, they'll have to give us an amount of money to be able to invest in those sites in the local nature recovery strategy to achieve that 10%. Okay, so let's start with what else. Talk a little bit about the biodiversity metric. I won't repeat what I've written in my report, but it's just going to be an important piece of software that we will all need to be trained on going forward. Paragraph 33 there, so the implications for us as councils and for yourselves as members to think about is we need to ensure that we're effectively engaging and collaborating on the creation of that nature strategy. So making sure that, for example, Chorley, who I represent, have got some sites on that in that strategy, and we've identified our priorities so that where we've got sites coming in where they can't deliver BNG on site, and it's off-site, that we're getting our money spent in Chorley through our developments. Because it may be that there is actually other areas. It may be that where an area doesn't have priority sites or they've exhausted it and they don't need that investment, it can be other areas. We need to ensure that the data used for Central Lancashire for our authority is accurate, and that it includes all of our data on species and local habitats. A lot of this is about local knowledge. I am not an open space officer, and I think, we've had a conversation in my team today, and I'm lucky that I've got an open space officer lives in Chorley and has worked for the council for longer than I have, 20 years, 25 years, and her knowledge is fantastic. And I think that will be really important. So making sure that we've got representation on that Lancashire nature partnership and feeding in information about our sites, making sure that there's something called a Lancashire Environment Network data, is it LERN? Yeah, where we're storing all data about our sites and our habitats. I think it's making sure that at a local level that's an accurate representation of all the sites that you have in your area. We need to align our planning policies to the local nature recovery strategy, and that's where Caroline and the team come in. That's really important. Training staff to understand LNRS and the BNG. We also need to think about the process of planning decision making. Now that's a year or so away, 2023, but we need to think about what that's going to look like for you and your DM team, and in terms of resourcing and capacity and expertise, and also how we're going to ensure, and this may be prescribed in regulations, we don't know yet, but in terms of how we're going to monitor and require that BNG to be delivered and over what period of time, whether it's going to be conditioned or whether it be a section 106 or whatever. And then there's a little bit there about the nature partnership, which I've talked about. Yeah, Lancashire Environment Record Network, that's the source of the data. And there's a bit about the training. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Zoe. Another great report. Fantastic. Anybody, any questions or comments?
Thank you, Chair. 10% uplift, is that a charge? Is that what we're talking about?
It's not a charge, it's a biodiversity value. So it's a 10% increase or improvement in the biodiversity that's on that site. So obviously...
So the developer has to improve so there will be a charge in a sense because he has to pay for this.
They'll have to get expertise, so they'll have to have, I would imagine, in the same way you do a flood or travel, ecology, you'll have to have, the applicant will have to submit a report that is on BNG and where it is now and how they're going to leave it or improve it. And if they can't improve it, there will be sites where they can't, if it's a volume builder, or there's no provision to put a pond in or whatever it might be, it may be off-site. And that's where that strategy comes in, because that's where the software will determine the value, the credit, as they know,
just
determine where you're spending it.
Just my concern is obviously it puts the price of houses up again.
It's a viability issue, and we will have to factor that into our viability assessment. The problem for us as a local plan making partnership is the timing of it. It's typical, isn't it? Because it's not going to come until 2023. Hopefully by then we'll be really far down the line in plan.
Yeah, maybe.
What have kicked in. So for viability reasons, it's going to be really difficult. And what we don't want to do is adopt a local plan, start processing our planning applications and straight away get viability challenges on BNG.
Okay, all right.
Well, yeah, thank you, Chair. I almost didn't ask a question, but these policies obviously come in when the plan's adopted and they have full weight in any planning application at that stage. What weight can be given to these policies? They're not policies now, but as they discuss them and it's a way forward. Is there any weight that can be attached to these policies or that these policies we're talking about in current planning applications or planning applications we are about to receive?
It's a good question. I mean, I can't quote it, but we do have some policies at the moment around biodiversity. So we in theory would look favourably at any application tomorrow that would come in that's, providing lots and lots of stuff on biodiversity. But in terms of what we're talking about here, the 10% uplift, that will come in the moment it's enacted by statute or regulations, regardless of where our local plan is up to. So they may actually cross over. It could actually potentially come in before our local plan is adopted or has been through an inquiry.
Environment Act became enacted on the 10th of November.
Yeah, but in terms of the provisions of the 10% uplift,
It's fine, whatever. It's a second.
But the, whilst it isn't a policy, I mean, it's going to be a noted document, and we're obviously working towards a theme and a policy. So it does have an impact, does it? Or it does have a weight on the planning application that might come in tomorrow. And I know we have a biodiversity policy now, but does this add to it and strengthen it?
I don't think so, because at the moment it's just subject to consultation. So DEFRA, there's consultation documents that have closed now. I think on the last one we're still waiting for their outcomes report. These obviously were just pilots. As Carolyn said, the Environment Act has been enacted, but the detailed regulations and secondary legislation hasn't come in yet. So we can't require it at this moment.
Okay, thanks, David.
I just want to follow on from that, because presumably, if we know this is coming, planning offices in all three authorities will be having pre-application discussions and post-application discussions, and planning officers seek to improve a planning application over and above the minimum. So the fact that this is coming, presumably, would be part of the discussions that planning officers could have to improve the application by anticipating that this will come in, irrespective of when it fits in the actual timetable.
In theory, yes. I mean, I'm looking to Jonathan because I'm not close to DM, I'm policy. But in theory, yes, DM officers could be looking at this and our existing policy and encouraging through pre-app discussions. Well, you know, it'd be really nice if we saw an improvement in particular species, or if you put a pond, or there's a pond, but can you enhance it because it's quite poor quality?
Yeah, just to add in, it is cropping up in discussions already, this very issue, and I think we are starting to get responses from our ecological advisors, which are raising this issue, because obviously there's some schemes that are maybe in with us for outline application now, and the reserve matters will be in potentially 2023 where they need to be addressing it. So it is starting to be in discussions on applications at the moment.
All right, thanks for that, Jonathan. Anybody else? No, in that case, thank you, Zoe, for answering all the questions and your report. It's for noting. Are we noted? Right, item number 9, exclusion of